And tonight we're going to be presenting a budget update, and I really want to hit on three key areas for this budget update tonight. The first one is, as we talked about in January when we were setting budget priorities, one of the most concerning things to me right now is getting our reserve levels built back up. So I want to address that with the board tonight. Second key point is I want to talk about state budget challenges. We did have an economic report released from the state, the two state reporting agencies, and the economic outlook has not improved. In fact, it's gotten a little bit worse, so we'll talk about that, and I will also try to address where the risks are. I was hoping I'd have more answers around the state's budget today, but we are hearing word from the state that we probably will not see a complete budget picture until later this month. So we'll be providing updates as we can. The last thing I wanted to do in the presentation tonight was focus on some of the key budget assumptions, just so that you understand kind of what we're using to develop the budget and to move forward, understanding those pieces. So the first one, bullet point one, is restoration of PSD reserves. And just to remind the board, we, after running an October count adjustment through the January budget revision, I indicated to the board that we believe that the reserve levels for the end of this fiscal year, as we project forward, and obviously we're not done with the year yet, but as we project those levels, we believe that that reserve level is going to drop significantly down to about $600,000 or $0.6 million as displayed on this slide. And as we talked about at that time, this is a level below acceptable levels. And in fact, we have a fund balance policy, DBAA, general fund balances, that calls for 3 to 5% of unassigned reserves. So I forgot to do the math on the 0.6, but I believe that's about a 0.2% or 0.4, somewhere in that range, of which is nowhere near the 3% minimum that we call for in this fund balance policy. Some things to consider as we talk about reserve restoration. The first one is, yes, I understand there's a range of 3 to 5%, but given what I'm going to be talking about in the rest of this presentation, I think it's important to understand that reserves are what protect us from uncertainty and for the unforeseen. And I'm going to be talking about a lot of uncertainty and unforeseen possibly in the rest of this presentation. So targeting the low range to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think we need to be above that target, because what we're going to find is we'll be chasing our tail, so to speak. We may hit the minimum, and then there will be something that happens. We're below the minimum, and we're having to replenish, and it's going to be a never-ending cycle. And really, when we talk about uncertainty, we talk about some big pieces. So, you know, we talk about the October count adjustment that we had this year. That was $3 million to the district. That's a pretty big chunk of money that evaporated very quickly after we finished our count. So those uncertainties can happen, and that's why we do have a fund balance policy that talks about having adequate reserves. So one of my biggest focuses is restoring those reserves to an acceptable level. If you were to ask me what my recommendation is, I would say no less than $9 million right now, or I think that calculates out to be about 3.6%. Okay? I'd much rather be higher than that, more smack dab in the middle of the range of about 4%. But I believe that that targeting the range slightly above the minimum is prudent and necessary, and we may even go a little bit further if we have the opportunity to do that. But those are considerations as we talk about fund balance, and I cannot emphasize enough that understand that reserves are what protects us from the uncertainty, and the state's budget is very uncertain right now. I felt I needed to do some due diligence to just inform the board as to where we're at with reserve restoration, because we have been working on it. You'll see I put in parentheses up here, this is not finalized, but these were some of the options I presented the last time I talked about budget with the board, and how we might move from the 600,000 where we're projecting the ending balance to be this year to getting back to that acceptable level of what I had targeted was 9. Right now we're displaying 9.5. This is not finalized. These numbers will change. But the first one is probably the one that we've been talking most about for the last 2 months, is carryover balances. And we talked about that in the board meeting last time when we set budget priorities. And the board did identify at that point and supported the idea of looking at carryover balances at schools and departments and determining where there may be excess money that could be swept back to help with our reserve level. During that process, we had identified and swept about just under $6 million of reserves. And midstream in the process right now, we believe that we're right at about $4 million of reserves that, that may be able to be going back to the unassigned reserve category. There's still a couple pieces that we're working through as cabinet, and so maybe this number might get a little bit better. I don't anticipate that it'll go the other direction at this point, although this still is not finalized. So I do want to recognize that this was an extremely hard conversation to have across the district. This is something that we have not deployed in my 11 years here as a strategy, but it is one that's necessary. And in fact, as I talk about what the state's doing with their budget, you're going to see very similar type aspects that the state's doing, and I suspect many other districts are doing the same right now. So we do have some company in this concept here. Just because I know that people are always interested in, well, how much is coming from schools and how much is from central, the 3.9 breaks out to be about 800,000 from school carryover and about 3.1 million from central. And again, I cannot emphasize enough, this is pending final recommendation, so we're still mid-process, but I thought it was good to update the board as to where we're at. Moving across this, and this is really a summary of the options that are available to us to restore reserves. The second one on this is we talked about possibly reducing the Board of Education established contingency reserve from 2% to 1%. If we were to do that, that would gain another 2.4 that we could flow to unassigned. I do believe that we could accomplish that without jeopardizing our overall reserve levels. So I don't have much heartburn on that. Obviously, the board would want to weigh in on that at some point too. If we were to further exhaust the Board of Education contingency reserve, I do think we would want to, if we were to go below that 1%, I do believe we may want to think about modifying the fund balance policy beyond 3 to 5% and maybe talk about 4 to 6% if we're going to do that. So I know it sounds like we're moving numbers around on the page, and that's exactly what we're doing here. Just understand, I do believe that the 3 to 5% plus 1% is really kind of where we need to be. So however we slice and dice that's what I would like to see at the end of the endeavor that we're taking. The third option here is, as we've talked about in other board meetings, is that we're a year behind schedule for new construction and the growth-related items. Next year, we do have the opportunity to collect $2.6 million from the override that was approved by the voters. And one of the thoughts here, again, these are options, nothing's finalized here, but one of the thoughts here is that we may just retain that and not spend that and allow it to flow to unassigned reserves. The fourth bullet point here is ongoing reductions to restore reserves. We have not identified those. Those may be coming in a future iteration as we prepare the 17-18 budget for balancing revenue and expenditure in there. So more inclined to look for one-time money to help solve this reserve issue before we go to ongoing cuts to restore reserves. Okay. This is where we're at. Again, I just wanted to update the board to say that we are in process on this. We're making headway, but we're not done yet. So now shifting gears to the state budget. State budget forecasts were released on Friday, and I've read through them a couple times. They're very lengthy documents. I've got them here, and I'll probably read through them a couple more times because they are written by economists and they are sometimes written cryptically, so you have to kind of read between the lines. But what's the big takeaway? The state's facing a $700 million gap in their budget right now. And I'm gonna walk you through what that is so that you can understand that better. But you'll see on the next chart that the increases to K-12 of about $370 million are part of that $700 million. So to think that the state's going to be able to address all this without increasing the negative factor, I think would be an error on our part at this time. I've highlighted that error in red so that we can talk about it and I can really address it formally as we go through the process here. So when we look at the $700 million gap, and I took this right out of the Office of State Planning and Budgeting's economic report that they released. As I talked about, the $370 million is new enrollment and inflation. Also included in there, and I had to get confirmation of this via text today, also in there, and I've got a whole slide on it, so I'm kind of alluding to another slide, is anticipations from adjustments from the Gallagher Amendment. I felt that that really deserved a slide of its own, so I'm going to focus on that one. But just keep that in mind, that part of that includes adjustments that they're talking about with the residential assessment rate. They also talked about Tabor rebates, 135 million here. I understand that there was some legislation to try to delay those, and that has died. So this is still real, $135 million Tabor rebate. The state is looking to restore about $260 million of reserves because their reserve has dropped below their statutory level. And so they will be looking at restoring reserves. Now, there may be legislation or efforts to try to change the statutory reserve levels, but that's something the state's going to be needing to think about. There's also some Senate bill, we call them Senate Bill 228 transfers to capital and transportation, $163 million of those. And the last piece is that there's new Medicaid costs. Don't confuse that with Medicaid billing that we'd be doing here. This is statewide. That's $141 million. So you can see that the state has summarized about $1 billion of increased need, and they've got $374 million to address that need, leaving a $696 million, we'll round it up to $700 million gap. Okay? And you can see that K-12 makes up more than half of that. Also on the side of which I like this, it does talk about the source of the requirement. Some of these come from the Constitution, some of these come from statute. So obviously the Constitution's much harder to change than statute, but even some of the statutes that these are referencing I think would be extremely hard to change. So we'll have to pay attention as the Joint Budget Committee thinks about how they're going to address this $700 million gap. So what options does this Joint Budget Committee have to close this gap? And again, we're hearing that the Joint Budget Committee will probably release this information by the 28th. I suspect we'll need a couple days to consider that and understand it, but things are going to start moving pretty quickly. In fact, one of my biggest concerns is that we're not seeing much legislation at all from the finance end, and that means either one of two things. That means that there's some ideas being put together and formulated, and they will be presented, and hopefully we like those. The other option is that it will spur a landslide of legislation on multiple ways of addressing this gap, but nothing will necessarily stick or make it through. So one's optimistic, one's pessimistic, and I can't tell which one we're on right now. But these are some of the ideas that they have that they're floating around is addressing the hospital provider fee. This is something that would reduce the Tabor cap or the Tabor refunds. And you know, they're thinking that that could help. This was something the legislature addressed and talked about heavily last year. It did not gain traction and it died. So I'm skeptical to see whether this happens again or not. But it is something that they are putting together as an option. I've highlighted in red, I told you there's two places where there's red in this presentation. Increases of K-12 negative factor were the second on the list, so to speak, and I think probably where most of this will land. Again, I'm not saying that definitively today. I just want to prepare us for the likelihood that that may happen if we come to March, the end of March, and we see that that's what the Joint Budget Committee decides to do. I alluded to this, that there could be some statutory changes to reserve levels, moving the state's reserve from 6.5% to some other level. There's also been floated some ideas around the marijuana tax and increases to that. Reductions to homestead exemptions, which impact seniors. These are all, and then the last one is sweeping of cash reserves across the state to help with this situation. None of these options are really palatable, and they're going to be hard to get to, but we need to start chipping away at this. So they are all important, because if we don't do any of the other ones, everything's going to fall onto the red. And we've seen that time and time again as the state balances their budget. So I would not be shocked to see it again. Gallagher is a big piece of this economic forecast that came out, and so I do believe it deserves some attention tonight, just so the board can understand this. Gallagher really is what sets our assessment rate for residential and commercial, and really the rate has been 7.96 since 2003, so it hasn't changed in over 14 years. What is the amendment? What is Gallagher? It was approved by the voters in 1982. It requires, this is what it requires, is that it requires the residential assessed values comprise no more than 45% of the state's assessed value, and then if you do the backward math, that means 55% non-residential. We'll call that commercial tonight. So what happens? Why are we talking about Gallagher? The housing market has increased at a faster pace than the commercial, and what that's doing is it's triggering a mandatory cut for homeowners. And residential homeowners is what we're talking about, the residential side. Because the residential is growing at a faster pace than the commercial, they can't increase the commercial rate because that would require a vote of the people. The only option they have is to reduce the residential assessment rate to keep that ratio in check. So what does that mean? They're talking about changing the residential assessment rate from 7.96 down to 6.56. I'm pulling this data out of a Denver Post article that was written in January. I know there's other numbers floating around out there. We'll get the numbers when we see the real data. But I think that this is still ringing fairly true to what we're looking at. This is an 18% drop in assessed valuation. So that is causing burden on the state, and it's also included in the $700 million shortfall, but that's really adding about $170 million to that statewide K-12 bill because they're already factoring in the fact that we're going to be outside of that ratio that Gallagher requires. So hopefully that gives a little background on the Gallagher. I've been getting a lot of questions on Gallagher because nobody's really talked about it probably since 2003. So we're talking about it again. Key legislation, School Finance Act has yet to be introduced. Sometimes we might see a School Finance Act at this time, but everything I've been talking about at the state level, we're just not going to see that until the Joint Budget Committee gets together and puts together the long bill. So we're going to have to wait. And I know that that's uncomfortable, but that's the reality where we're at. Another key piece of legislation, I think that the board, I know the board's aware of this. We talked about it in legislative subcommittee, but there is a Senate bill 61 out there which is addressing additional funding for charter schools. And what this bill requires is the sharing of all mill levy overrides. And as I looked at it, we currently share about 1.2 million with district charters. This bill would require us to go back to previous overrides and potentially share those at a cost of possibly $1.5 million as currently written. We did talk a little bit in legislative subcommittee that there's been some amendments to this bill to phase that in over 3 years, so it may not happen as quickly. It may not be as big a burden on our budget right away if it passes. But it is something to consider because this is another piece that, that is tying into the budget that is currently being talked about in the legislature. Also, I think it's important to understand that the legislators need to understand this, that as new charter schools come in, that's going to continue to be a drain on district resources. So that's going to be important for them to understand that this legislation not only has impacts on current budgets, but it will have possibly impacts on future budgets out into the future. So now I want to shift gears and finalize some key budget assumptions, and this is really, there's not a lot here because we have minimum assumptions this year. There's not a lot moving. There's some big pieces moving though. The first one is that we fully expect that the negative factor will most likely increase. Don't know how much. The governor had originally proposed $50 million in November. If they have to apply a larger percentage of that gap to K-12, it could be close to another $200 million. I don't know what the ceiling is. But just understand there's the opportunity for that to happen. The red numbers below are based on an inflation rate of 2.8% and a PSD growth rate of 0.34%, of which we're currently using in the district for our growth for next year. Using that, and this data is stale, so I have highlighted it in red. We're trying to put together the picture the best we can. But looking at some prior data from CDE and some internal modeling, we think we could have about $5.8 million to spend if that was fully funded. Okay. The biggest question is, and this is highlighted, this is why this whole section is highlighted in red, the second part, is this assumes the state can resolve the $700 million shortfall, of which I'm not optimistic about. Okay. So if any of that doesn't get resolved, I'm concerned that that may end up going into the negative factor and reducing this $5.8 million that I've put on the chart. Okay. We will continue to feel some cost pressures in the district. While some of those have decreased because our growth rate has decreased slightly for the next fiscal year, we do still need to fund some of that growth to student-based budgeting and integrated services in ELL as we have more students. So yes, we are growing a little bit, but you can see that that cost is much lower than it typically is. In our typical growth pattern of about 1.5%, that's usually about $1.3 million. So we're thinking that that's going to be closer to under $500,000 this year, and we've already deployed student-based budgeting, so we know a big portion of that piece already. Para is required by statute, and we're expecting to pay another $700 million toward para next year. That will be the last of the statutory increases for para, but I have already heard in a presentation from para that given their funding ratio, there is para legislation on the horizon next legislative session. It is going to, they were very clear that they're going to have to make some changes in para. Their current funding ratio is way beyond the 30 years that they're targeting, and I would expect that we may see future increases to keep para in balance. I don't know exactly what that legislation is going to look like, but I'm just trying to set the stage for next year too, that we've got more issues on the horizon. We do negotiate some cost drivers. Health and dental, we were projecting 5%. I know that the benefits committee met today and I was not able to attend that this afternoon. So hopefully this data is not too stale, but we do think there's about $700,000 in increased cost for the employer for health and dental. Obviously the employees would also burden some of that increased cost too. Step costs, we're projecting about $3.8 million. Cost of living adjustment is about 1.6 per 1% if provided. And the retirement differential, this is an offset to cost. This is actually helping us. We're still using last year's projection of about $1.4 million to help offset some of these costs, but we will really get a better picture of that as the retirement paperwork comes in, actual paperwork. I did not do a good job of summarizing all of this, but if you were to summarize all of these numbers that I just talked about, the new revenue, the increased costs, maybe pull that cost of living out to the side because that's yet to be determined. If you were to do all of that, that leaves us about $500,000 to spend. So that's not a good place to be, and that obviously doesn't even get us a 1% COLA if we provide STEP, increased health, all those other things that I've talked about. Okay. Wanted to go full circle and make sure we come back to process and a couple pieces. In January, we met with the board, and the board had identified and reviewed the budget priorities. So I've put together a slide based on that conversation. I did re-watch the board meeting to make sure I captured everything, and if I didn't, please let me know. Maybe not right now, but we can make adjustments. But I believe, you know, restoration of unassigned reserves, we heard that clear, that could be a bullet point. Talked about not changing many of the focus areas because we do believe that they're still valid, and they may be very effective for us if we have to start cutting. That's the other side of a priority, is it can also tell you where to stay away from if you have to cut, as opposed to where you need to add to. And so those pieces have not changed. And then I got the understanding that the long-range planning is something we need to just keep track of going forward. It may not be a focus area, but we don't want to lose track of the fact that we're going to have to be constantly thinking about long-range planning. And then this is the one I really struggled with. There were some terms used in the board meeting around protecting employees and things like that. If I got this wrong, please tell me, but I think what we're really talking about is maintaining competitive salaries and benefits for employees, if we can. Understand that that may be a priority that is tough to get at, but we did talk in the board meeting quite about protecting employees and looking out for employees. So if that's not what we talked about, please let me know. Budget process, I talked about this last time, and I know I'm over time, so budget process is displayed here. We just met with, we just had the tactical leadership meeting. We've delayed some of these meetings, hoping that we get more budget information from the economic forecast. That just is not happening. Budget Advisory Committee is scheduled to begin their work shortly in the next week. So we're moving along through the process, and we are still on track for having a budget that we would bring to the board for adoption in June. This is a breakdown of the key critical timelines coming forward and opportunity for questions. I do want to, I don't think there's anything that I haven't talked about already through the presentation here, so the timeline is there if you have questions.
Questions? Comments? Nate?
Yes, one of your slides you talked about the Office of State Planning and Budgeting forecast from last Friday. How does, and you don't have to answer this right now, but why did you choose that one versus Legislative Council, and how do they differ, and is it significant at this point because they're just forecasts?
You know, I have not done the cross-reference between the two reports. I know that the Joint Budget Committee is using this $700 million number. It
Okay.
is probably, what happens when they have the two reports is they typically will take the most conservative out of both and
Okay.
sometimes combine them. I'm not saying that that's exactly what happened because I've seen it happen different ways at times, but typically what they will do is look at the most conservative and try to incorporate that into what the Joint Budget Committee works with.
Okay, that's enough. That's good.
Yeah.
Cool. And then on the, this may be an untouchable, but the Senate Bill 228, Transportation and Capital, is that a, do you know if that's a fixed amount, and has that ever been subject to negotiation in a budget, or is that just a given, whereas a K-12 and other elements of the budget are more discretionary?
Yeah, this one has, I mean, it was passed in 2009, so not too long ago. This one is one that we've been paying attention to because we knew it's coming. I believe, and this is where maybe a little bit of my optimism is showing, I believe that they are trying to look at different ways to pay for this through the state budget, and so this may be one of the ones that they are able to resolve. I don't know what that plan looks like, though, so I've just heard some backroom discussions that, yeah, we're trying to figure something out on transportation because we know that the Senate Bill 228 transfers are away on the budget, but to answer your question directly, it is statute-driven, so it could be, in my opinion, rewritten. I don't know that the legislature has the will to do that because transportation has needs also across Colorado. I mean, we know that as we drive up and down from Denver every day. Or not every day, but when we do drive from Denver.
Sure. Okay. And then can you go back to the slide about the reserve replenishment and
Yep.
those numbers? Back before that one.
Okay?
What's the, okay, so 7.5 million at 3%, 12.5, and I was wondering when you were talking about you don't want to do the minimum, but how is 3.6% adequate in terms of a reserve? Obviously, obviously, all that goes into reserves isn't available for the current year budget, but how did you arrive at the 3.6% versus something else?
If you're asking for what is my rationale completely, some of it is a gut check.
Okay.
Honestly, what I looked at is $1.5 million would be available for unforeseen events in that fiscal year or future fiscal years without dropping below the 3%. And considering that we had an October count adjustment of $3 million, I understand that we can't go too high on the reserves, but so this, in my mind, was a good balance. But it's open for discussion for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Rob?
So I have a couple of things just to clarify what I think I heard you say, and then a sort of a broader conversation. In terms of clarification, what I think I heard you say on the sweeps is that you originally swept, if you will, $6 million, and then through the process whereby schools and departments were able to say, hey, no, I needed some of that money that you swept, the number went down to whatever it is, 3.9 million.
Right.
Right? That's how
Yeah.
that worked?
Yeah,
Okay, so there definitely was an opportunity, and it has actually resulted in $2 million going back to schools and departments when they were able to justify the need
Right.
for more than 10% carryover.
yeah, and in fact, we had two situations where that would apply, so let me describe that a little bit. One is, because this sweep, we only really know carryover at one point in time,
Yeah.
and that's the end of the fiscal year. So we were basing this 10% sweep on the July 1st, 2016 balance. Some departments had already committed some of that carryover for things they were planning on doing, like PD had some big PD efforts with the math adoption that they had already committed a lot of that carryover for. We're 3/4 of the way through that. We're not going to stop that at this point. So some of those were restored just because we had already committed them. Some of them, of which we were really focusing on, is for future needs. And so there was a lot of discussion around, is that a legitimate need? Is it something that we may not need to do, or can we do it in a different way? But those were really the two that I saw, and probably more focused was on the first one.
Okay. So the second sort of clarification area was around Senate Bill 61, I think you said it was, the one that would require districts to share mill levy overrides with charters, regardless, as I understand it, regardless of whether the charters were in existence at the time the mill levy override was passed, which has the effect of that last bullet item, which is if a new charter school were approved within the district tomorrow, we would, based on their student population, we would need to allocate funds which we are currently using in the district for schools and operations and whatnot. We would need to take some of those funds and send them instead to this new charter school. Is that an accurate understanding?
As we interpret the bill as written, that's what we're seeing.
Okay, yeah. And yeah, that's concerning because it's sort of it potentially is an open-ended drain on resources. Now, I understand that charter school kids
Yeah.
need resources as well, but we need to be able to have predictability in what we're doing going
To
forward.
further complicate this, and I have not gone back and reviewed our ballot questions, but if the ballot questions were very specific for use, and I know that's true in some other districts, I think there's also a legal question as to the voters approved it for this specific use. How can the legislature come in and say, no,
Yeah.
you got to use it this way?
I understand.
So that's going to be something I think that may be battled in the court, even if this is passed.
Okay. So now the broader question. You said that we might have, as you know, with all those needs you identified, all those spending areas you identified with the healthcare costs and the STEP and the not including the cost of living increase and whatever, we might have $500,000 if we get the
Yes.
whole 5.8 million,
If the
which
red-
is only going to happen if they actually fund that whole $370 million in the list of needs that you showed earlier. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Okay, so,
This
I mean-
is the uncertainty I was alluding to.
right,
And again, the importance for us to get our reserve level back to where it needs to be, because we've weathered much of the recession and the negative factor because we've been well reserved, and we're not to that point any longer, so we need to get back there.
okay, well, I appreciate that statement and the clarification around this, because I guess I would say that I think it's highly unlikely. I don't know how, we're not going to get $5.8 million. It's just not going to happen, you know, unless some miracle happens down at the state. And therefore, I want to make sure that our public understands that that number is the best case, and at least my reading of the tea leaves, for what it's worth, is the best case isn't going to happen. So it's going to be less than that.
I don't disagree with any of those
Okay.
statements, and that's exactly what I would say. Now, I will be more than happy to stand in front of the board in April or May and say, you know what, everything happened the way the state said it would, and we're good, and we got the
Yeah.
5.8 million. I
And-
just don't know that I'm going to be able to do that.
Sure. No, I understand that. And I guess that really leads me to the broader concern that I wanted to get to, and that is that as I understand the state's financial position, with regard to Gallagher and Tabor and the obligations that we have around Medicaid and other things. Again, not the Medicaid funding we've been talking about previously, but the state's obligations with regard to Medicaid and whatnot. We're going to be in a position, that is, the state's going to be in a position in the next few years, and we're talking just a few years here, like 2 or 3 or 4 kind of years, where the state's not going to be able to fund anything beyond, like prisons and
Yes.
healthcare and the base funding of schools. So basically there'll be none of the factors associated with schools available for anyone. And I guess my request would be, and maybe I should make the request to Dr. Smizer, but my hope, let me put it that way, and the board should participate eventually in this, is that we put together a picture of where we think this is going so that we can really educate our constituents, our population here in Poudre School District about if nothing changes, the likely result is going to be some significant financial impacts to this district and even more significant financial impacts to other districts that rely more heavily on the factors, and frankly, a significant financial problem for the state as a whole, which has much broader implications in terms of the economic vitality of the state and a whole lot of other things that we're not going to like. And so I think I'd really ask that we take a very proactive view in making that understood so that our public can make some choices about whether we want to hit that economic crisis and then have to deal with it and say, oh my gosh, the house is on fire, or whether we try to make some changes in the way funding and tax policy and whatever are done in the state so that we can avoid that crisis.
Yep.
And so
Yep.
I guess enough said, but I'd like to see us put together some projections at the school district level about the potential impacts so that people know what we're talking about and it's not just hand wavy kind of stuff.
Dr. Smizer?
I agree, and I think that the tendency of us humans is to wait until the house is on fire before we run out the door. And I think that because this is such a big problem, people are starting to notice at the State House, and they are beginning to get some coalitions together to say, 4 years from now it's going to be maybe unfixable if we don't do something. So I do think the more forward-looking people are beginning to try to get together and start talking about what do we need to do now to keep that from happening. And here locally, I like your suggestion that we can put our best guess as what PSD will look like 3 years from now if nothing changes. We've been talking so long about lack of funding, and I think my biggest message for the community is this is different. This is future lack of funding altogether for schools in the state. It's a financial crisis really for the state, not just for schools,
Yes.
but for all of state funding, for all state functions. And so I think our legislators, many of them are across the aisle, are beginning to say we have to do something.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I understand and appreciate that. I think that the key element, both from a political will point of view and just from a practical point of view, is some of the solutions some of the solution is going to require, at least in my estimation, changes to some of the constitutional provisions and other things that the public will have to vote on. So it's very important to inform that debate, and I just want us to do our part in that. Thanks.
David?
I just want to add a couple things to this. I think basically everybody knows this. Our problem to this point in dealing with the legislature is to wait for the legislature to produce a bill and then decide which ones we like and which ones we don't like, and then do some lobbying. I think we're talking about a shift in our approach to get out in front and to say, here's where we are now, and then we've kind of planted the seeds or whatever to address what gets brought up down the road. It's going to be a nasty 3-4 years or more. everybody is kind of assuming that everybody else will make the cuts, that they can somehow preserve their own bailiwick. Earlier, was it this week or late last week, there was an attempt to modify the formula for determining the Tabor cap. It was defeated. A more positive, a more lucrative way to define the Tabor cap was voted down in committee on a straight party line vote, 3-2 in the Senate. So I don't know. We have to kind of say, what's our story? We have to decide it now. And get on it before we even hear proposals from out of Denver.
Nate?
I just wanted to add to that in the past, it's taken 3 to 5 years to build a coalition to get some significant changes done. When it used to take an hour to drive from here to the Capitol in about 2000 in rush hour, I was going down there to serve on a committee that was the precursor to what became the effort for referenda C and D, which I think passed in 2005, and that took 3 to 5 years to build the coalition just to get that done. And since then, there have been efforts that have been passed by the legislature or by initiative that try to get it done in a year or two, and they've all failed. And so this effort's going to take 3 to 5 years just to get something on the ballot to build enough support to get it to pass. So like Dr. Schmeiser said, we don't really have the time to wait until we hit the wall before we decide that we're going to try to get this going. So we need to get it going sooner rather than later. Thanks.
Sounds like we've got our work penciled out for us now and in the summer.
So if you do the math, the numbers that in that gap, it's about $370 million. And Dave usually tells us that back of the napkin calculation, so approximate, not actual numbers, is our district is about 3% of that. So if you do the math, our district, if they don't figure out how to close the gap at all, we're down $11 million, okay? Over $11 million. Now, you're cringing when I say that. I know you don't want to toss that kind of number out there, but it's not just a scare tactic.
I think what
it's something that's scary.
I think what I've heard, and so this is where we just need to get the clear picture from the proposal that goes to the Joint Budget Committee toward the end of the month. What I've heard is that 370 million may be reduced, but that may, I mean, what that says is we may not have new revenue to spend next year. I'm not sure that I would double it yet, but I think we just need to wait for the proposal because we're all kind of guessing at this, so.
But I think people are not understanding how serious this is. We're talking
is-
about,
right.
there are 178 school districts in Colorado. They range in size from about 50 kids in an entire district to over 90,000. So one size does not fit all. That's one reason we have things called
Yep.
factors. When you don't have the economies of scale that we do, we have in the non-charter part of our district, over 27,000 students. That gives us some economies of scale. If you don't have those, sometimes you have your superintendent, who's also the principal, who's also the bus driver, and also probably cleaning the bathroom between breaks or something. It's just, there's a lot going on. And some of these really tiny districts, as bad as we have it here, they are in danger of bankruptcy. Now, you tell me what bankruptcy means to a school district when we are legally required to educate every child within our boundaries. What the heck does that mean? I'm just saying that we're in a really,
This-
really bad position.
This
right
is
now.
serious. I'm gonna even piggyback a little bit on what you said there, because what you just described, the superintendent out on the Eastern Plains that's driving the bus and teaching the class and all of that. Imagine doing that, what you're doing now, but with 60% less revenue than you have. That's what some of the modeling is projecting for those districts that are getting large factors. Now, I don't mean to sound like I'm optimistic about this, but because we're a floor-funded district, we don't have as far to fall. That doesn't even feel good to say that, but we're still potentially talking about an $18, $20 million reduction over the course of 4 or 5 years. Will Poudre School District weather that? Yes. Will we be the same district that we are? No. Will the Eastern Plains District survive a 60% cut in their budget? I have no idea how that can happen.
Me neither. Hey, I do have one actual question. Is there, in the reserves that we're trying to fill back up, is there any natural way or normal way that those reserves would get filled without going through the types of steps, which are very deliberate, that you described?
Yeah. There's a couple ways. One is we can be intentional about adding new revenue, carving off pieces to restore reserves. Probably more to your question is, though, if we are successful with conservative budgeting assumptions, what that typically means is that expenditures should be under revenues, and in that case, we would restore some money to reserves. And we've had history of doing that over time, just not over the recent years.
Other comments, questions? Carolyn?
Because funding seems like it's going to be in flux, and that I don't want to say every year, but it seems like with the funding being so in question over the next 2 to 3 years, are we doing any long-term forecasting? Like, do we have a 2 or a 3-year plan?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we were just talking about doing, is really, because we do multi-year planning. If you look in some monitoring reports, we have multi-year plans in there. They're not at the level that we're talking about. We're talking about getting into the nitty-gritty a little bit more and really pinpointing what do we think our changes in revenue are going to be. I think it's worthwhile. We have not done it to the level I think we're talking about tonight.
Follow-up question then. So this year, we swept up some carryovers that are going to help restore our general fund.
Yes.
Now, I know that next year there won't be carryovers to sweep up in case our general fund isn't balanced. So in that case, if our general fund was short next year, how would you think you would go about restoring that general fund? Because we won't have carryovers to sweep next time.
Yeah, and even more incentive for me talking about we need to be off the floor of 3% because we need to have reserves for that. Honestly, I mean, I don't want to put fear in the system, but we did not sweep all carryovers. We only swept above anything that was above 10% of a school or department's annual allocation. So there's still a lot of carryover out there. We have not swept it to that level yet. That's 10% is still above the 3 to 5% that we recommend. But more pointed to your question, we'd probably be looking at mid-year cuts.